Hi and welcome to the video. Before we start, this video isn't meant to be a comprehensive guide on securing WordPress. Ultimately, security is a balance between usability and protection. So for example, if we look at multi-factor authentication, if you don't have it, it's much easier to sign in, but the risk of a security breach is higher. If you have a retinal scanner, voice recognition, and fingerprint protection, usability suffers, and you probably don't need all of that just to sign into your WordPress admin area. If the highest level of security is what you want, I'd probably recommend further research, but I've tried to find a balance between sensible security and not making it too confusing or difficult to implement. So I'm going to take a start by looking at all of the components that make up your WordPress site, just so you can understand how attackers might breach your website and just to help you understand why we take some of the security measures that we do. So there are three main components when it comes to security. Firstly, you've got your WordPress application itself, which is the part your visitors interact with, so your website, and that is the thing that you're responsible for as a user. This application sits on a front-end server, which is the second area to be aware of, and Fasthosts own that front-end server in this example, or if you're with another host, they'll own that front-end server. The third area is the database server, which is where all the user data, blog posts, and page content is stored, among a few other things. And again, that's on a server that will be owned by your hosting provider. We're going to focus mainly on the WordPress application itself in this video, as there's not really too much for you to do on the server side of things if your website's with a reputable provider such as Fasthosts. So this video is targeted at users on shared hosting rather than server owners who would have to think about things like making sure the server operating system is kept up to date. So now we know the three main areas for security, let's go over some general security that you should be following. Okay, now we know about those three main areas. Let's take a look at some general security you should be doing, and then we'll move on to the WordPress specific stuff a little bit later. So first up, be prepared to recover. So make sure you've got up-to-date backups of your website and database. It's just so you can recover in the event of being compromised. And it's always better to have a backup you know is clean, even if it's a little bit older, just because sometimes if you've got a compromise where it's not massively obvious that you've been compromised, you might back up the compromise. So it's always good to have a clean version that's a little bit older, and so just so you've got it just in case. So access points is the next thing. So this is any area that requires a username or password. So you've got the database, the FTP server, and the admin area. So for all of these, you need to make sure you've got strong usernames and passwords. And I would recommend using a password manager, just because they can give you a strong password that you haven't got to remember the whole time. And also they'll generate one for you, and it just stops you from recycling passwords. The reason for a strong password is that something called a brute force attack will be when someone accesses one of the login areas for these three areas and just tries using as many username and password combination as they can in a very short amount of time. Obviously, if you've got a weak password, they'll probably crack it. You can protect yourself against brute force, and we'll come on to that a little bit later. Next up is on those areas, make sure you haven't got any unused users. Now, this is quite a common one, and say, for example, our database, if I go into one of my databases at one of my WordPress websites using, I can see, oh, I've got this world test user. I'm not using that username anymore. I should just delete it because it's just another area that can potentially be hacked into. When you go into WordPress, if you go to users, you can have a check and see at the moment I've only got one user. Perfect, that's great. You might have a website here where you require extra users, which is fine, but just make sure that the users that you've got are being used, because if they're not being used, the password could be weak, and it's just another area that could get compromised. Same for FTP, same principle for FTP. I won't go through the process now, but that's the three areas you just need to make sure your usernames, you haven't got any unused users. You should be using two-factor authentication as well, as a general rule. It's a good idea, that's really important to make sure all your users are accounted for, because if you've got two-factor authentication for one user, you should have it for another, because otherwise potentially that other user can be compromised. So next up, you've got only install from trusted sources. So if you're using custom themes, widgets, or whatever, make sure you either download them through the WordPress dashboard or from reputable websites. Next, use a secure network. So if you're working on your website, I wouldn't generally recommend using an open network, and that would be true of everything actually. Open networks can potentially mean you're sending your usernames and passwords across an unsecured network and they could be intercepted. So if you're doing a lot of work away from home, yeah, I'd consider a VPN just because, like I say, they're a good investment if you're doing a lot of work outside the office. Make sure your devices you access your site from have security. So if you're on a laptop, for example, make sure you've got antivirus on there because all the security in the world won't make any difference if your laptop's got a keylogger on and they're just logging your username and passwords from that. So that's the basics. That's just the general security you should be doing. Next up, we're going to have a look at some really easy things within WordPress that you can do, and then we'll move on to some more advanced stuff after that. Okay, so we'll start with some basic WordPress security. Now, this is security you can do without any plugins or additional sort of tweaking to the code or anything. So it's very simple. There are two main ways that WordPress websites get hacked. One of them is something called a HTTP request. You don't really need to know about it. The only thing you need to do is know how to mitigate it. And the other one is a brute force attack, which I sort of touched on briefly before. So if we go through some security features that you can use to try and mitigate these attacks, and that will be this section. So first things first, keeping things up to date. Now, I know I've sort of briefly touched on it, but it is the most important thing for making sure you haven't got any insecure plugins or any areas of your theme. So in the WordPress dashboard, it's got the updates and it will tell you everything that needs to be updated. It could be themes, it could be your plugins. Everything needs to be kept up to date. And the reason for that is, as I alluded to, the HTTP requests that usually exploits vulnerabilities in anything that's not up to date, and that could be a part of a theme or a plugin. So you just need to make sure everything is kept up to date. Next up, you need to check your active users. And if we go into the user section here, again, we only have the one user for this website, fine. If you've got multiple, it's a consideration. So you need to make sure those users are using strong passwords. Make sure you manage their roles and permissions because some people won't need a full administrator role. And if they do get compromised, they can do more damage with the more permissions that they've got. So passwords is the next one. All your users need to have strong passwords, and the reason is brute force attacks. If you've got a weak password, your site will get brute forced eventually, is likely. If you've got the password one, for example, it's incredibly likely at some point your website will get compromised. So make sure you're using strong passwords. So I said before, password managers are your friends because you don't reuse passwords and you don't have to remember really difficult ones. You only have to remember the password for your password manager. Most people don't like using strong passwords because they're hard to remember, which is understandable. Password manager takes away the pain of trying to remember strong passwords. So next, use SSL. So we can see that my connection here is HTTPS, so that's secure. Use SSL. It depends on your host how you implement that. With FastHost, it's just a one click, usually through the control panel. We do charge them after the first year for some packages. Just so it's worth noting there might be a cost involved, but it's definitely worthwhile using. Next up, use backups. So I use a plugin for my backups. You can do them yourself. Again, I will link to the video that I made on backing up WordPress. So really, if you do all of those things, strong passwords, making backups, keeping everything up to date, that's going to mitigate most attacks. But if you want to protect yourself even further, then there are some things you can do. And I generally would recommend now at this point using a security plugin. Now you can do a lot of it yourself, but to be honest, if you're not very technically minded, a plugin takes away the pain, quite frankly. And some of them are a little bit complicated to do, but you use a plugin and they'll do it for you. So that's going to be the next section of the video, what I would consider higher levels of security. Okay, this is the last section of the video now. So this is some advanced security that you can carry out on your website. And generally speaking, I would recommend it. I think there are some really sensible things in here that will just keep you nice and secure. And I've tried to make it so they're not difficult to implement. So I use security plugins for my WordPress installations. Some people like them, some people don't. It's a little bit of a matter of opinion, but for me, I'm not the most technically minded, so I find WordPress plugins a lot easier. I'd also like to point out at this point that there are some more technical things you can do to secure your WordPress websites, including things like changing the right read permissions on your WordPress files, changing file permissions, restricting files from being edited, things like that. They start getting a little bit complicated at that point. And for me, those sorts of features aren't necessarily required for more basic WordPress users. They can be useful because they can mean that if someone does hack into your website, they can't do as much damage. But like I say, sometimes I feel like they're a little bit overkill and they can cause usability issues. So like I said before, balancing between usability and security. But please do research if you'd like to look into some of these more secure, some more advanced security. Now, when it comes to security plugins, people will have their favorites, and people will find some are popular, more popular than others. For me, I use WordFence because I think there's a good balance between usability and the features it offers without actually costing anything. There are premium versions that give you a bit more sort of information, but again, there are other WordPress security plugins. Now, one thing to make sure you note is that if you're installing them, I would probably go through the dashboard myself. So if we go to plugins, if you want to find a security plugin, I would add it through here. So you can do the add new and just search for security. And the reason is for that is obviously the security ones are quite important, and you'll be able to see the reviews, how many active installations they have, the last updated, because the main thing with this is you want to make sure it's reputable. So I'll go through WordFence just in this video for some of these more advanced features, but again, you can use other apps, and there are individual apps for sort of the individual features if you like. So for two-factor authentication, you could just get a two-factor authentication app if you want something a bit more lightweight than a full-on security suite. But if we go into WordFence, I'll just quickly show you some of the features that I think are very useful from a medium security point of view. So in the dashboard here, there's some features, things like the firewall and a scan. Now these are useful because the firewall tries to limit the number of bots that visit your website. So generally speaking, you'll route your traffic through a sort of a DNS server that looks for bots, or it could just be a software file. Ultimately, you don't really need to know how it works. You just need to know that you can usually activate one, and they're probably a good thing to have. But just make sure that when you do activate it, everything works on your website as expected. A scan tends to look for any changes in your website files. So sometimes if you get quite a subtle attack, you won't actually know you've been compromised. The scan will just see any changes to your website files and let you know if there have been any changes. Useful thing to have. Again, different security plugins will do it differently, but it's a good thing to have. The common things you should be looking for with any security plugin is two-factor authentication. So that would be you set up and you use one of the authenticator apps. There are multiple. You've got the Microsoft one, the Google one. There are all the common ones you can set up two-factor authentication for. Now I won't show you how to do it in WordFence because you might be using a different plugin, but that's one of the common ones you should be using, two-factor authentication. And that just means you need your mobile device with that authenticator app every time you want to log in. Very useful to have. Next up, you should be looking for brute force protection. Now that brute force, like I said earlier, it could be when they go to your WordPress admin login page, they will use a multitude of username and password combinations to see if they can just access your website. And if you haven't got any protection, they can usually break in if you've got weak passwords. But again, brute force protection, all that does is limit the amount of failed login attempts before it blocks that person from trying to log in again. And really, those are the most common ones from a security app point of view. Now, like I say, you can get some really in-depth security ones that will change file permissions, change the amount, change them to read only, for example. But like I say, there are caveats with that. So sometimes you can have problems if you've got automatic updates on, for example. So, like I say, for me, those are maybe going a little bit far, but some people would disagree with me, and that is perfectly acceptable. So really, that's all there is to it now. Like I say, getting an app, getting a plugin is probably going to the level I would say is worthwhile. Some of those features you might not want to use though. Hopefully this video has been useful. It's supposed to have been fairly, it's not aimed at high level security because I think the usability that comes with that is the usability trade-offs are probably not necessarily worth it. It's a balance at the end of the day. But yeah, hopefully that's been useful. Thank you very much for watching. Goodbye for now.